Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for COVID-19 and a responsible RX supply chain. Our virtual event looking at the resiliency of the prescription drug supply chain during a global pandemic. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Healthcare Distribution Alliance, for their support of today's program. The coronavirus pandemic has upended our lives and forced a new normal upon us. While accommodations can be made for our lifestyle choices, there's little flexibility when it comes to our health care. For patients with chronic diseases and those most at risk from the coronavirus, access to regular medications isn't a choice. In some cases, it's a matter of life and death. In a pandemic, both the healthcare system and patients have changed their behaviors. As a consequence, concerns and fears have arisen surrounding drug availability and shortages. What are stakeholders doing to ensure that disruptions do not occur and there is collaboration between the public and the private sectors? And what plans are being put in place for the distribution of this corona vaccine once it becomes available? We're going to discuss all of this and much more with some of the smartest minds in health policy. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events. That's all together, The Hill Events. And the hashtag, there come special letters here, The Hill RX Supply Chain. The Hill RX Supply Chain. We're broadcasting live. We'll be taking your questions throughout the program, and I look forward to those. If you experience any trouble with the live stream, they say refreshing it will work. I hope. My first guest is national health expert and was on the front lines in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Governor Secretary Kathleen Sebelius served as the Health and Human Services Secretary under President Obama. She's now the CEO of Sebelius Resources, which provides strategic advice to companies, investors, and nonprofits. And she's my go-to person when it comes to issues of knowing what a smart healthcare system looks like. So, Kathleen, great to see you. Let me just ask you, I'll get to the point. You oversaw many of the institutions that we're now looking at today to help save this country, whether it's in, pushing the time curve on developing a vaccine and distributing it, whether it's on how you approve various dimensions of this in therapeutics. What would you say is going well? What would you say has just been awful?
Well, it's good to see you, Stephen. Thanks for including me in this program. I don't think there's any question that the so-called Operation Warp Speed, having the United States government bet on a number of possible vaccine candidates early on, push that pipeline, has really accelerated the possibility of getting a vaccine for a brand new coronavirus faster than people could have anticipated. And that's good news. That will be beneficial to the United States citizens and hopefully to the rest of the globe. I'd say that, collaboration, cooperation looks very good, and the early investment makes sense. So pharma companies really are drilling down on now massive clinical trials and looking at safety results and hopefully, competing to get to the starting line first, but we could have a number of effective, safe vaccines in kind of record time. The very bad news, again, sticking with just the vaccine development, is that at every point along the way, this White House, this president, has undercut the public science, undercut confidence in the public health messages, and by doing that, may really discourage a lot of Americans from ever volunteering to get the vaccine, ever believing that it is safe and effective. So that is really not helpful. Communication strategies, clear, effective, scientifically based communication from the start is part of any public health crisis, about any public health recovery, and tying the vaccine to his political election, which President Trump has done for months and months, suggesting that there'll be an October surprise, there'll be an effective vaccine before the campaign, there'll be, something coming out, makes people feel like it's being rushed, that we are not on track for safety and effectiveness. We are really on track for some kind of political gimmick, and nothing could be more harmful to the confidence that we're going to need for a massive vaccination campaign and a 2-dose vaccination campaign. So that has some good points and bad points. I would say in the rest of this coronavirus response, we've seen much of the same. public science, which has evolved over time, and scientists have learned more and corrected themselves when they learn more, undercut consistently by the White House, who has a very different agenda in mind, not public health and safety, but getting the economy back running as quickly as possible, regardless of the deaths, regardless of the disease. So we've had a point counterpoint in the United States, and I think the clearest indication of that is Johns Hopkins in the fall of 2019 gave grades to countries around the world for pandemic readiness, not knowing what we were going to face. The United States was regarded as the most prepared, best prepared country in the world, and yet we have had, I think, unquestionably the worst response for any developed country in the world.
Wow. Well, you were featured recently, you were one of the stars in Alex Gibney's new movie called Totally Under Control, which profiles the response thus far in responding to the pandemic, managing, everything from Operation Warp Speed to other dimensions of this. And I guess my question is, you have some real heroes that pop out in the show, some governors that were securing PPE, some companies that were stepping up. And part of the discussion today is really around supply chain and the coming drugs and therapeutics, and whether Americans can have confidence that there is an infrastructure out there that's dependable enough that they can have confidence and faith in, regardless of the leadership. And I'm just wondering how you see that, because you saw states competing with one another before over masks and gowns. I'm wondering, when a vaccine rolls out, will we be able to have the confidence that it will be well managed?
We will only have the confidence if we have a national plan. And I think it's clear that the current president does not want a national plan. He has pushed every issue onto states and sometimes into the private sector in a way that is not transparent to anyone, and put burdens, I would say, on states as a former governor that they can't possibly achieve. So PPE is a great example. Rather than the United States mobilizing efforts through the Defense Production Act to make more stuff in America, to get it ready to go, or to use their incredible purchasing power and previous global contacts to purchase PPE and then distribute it in a fair and equitable manner, use the Defense Department logistics to make sure that equipment and machinery was at the right place at the right time, that we had everything from a virtual inventory of where there were extra beds to where there were personnel. The federal government under Donald Trump washed his hands of it and said it's up to the states. So states competed against one another. States competed against their own health systems. Often I've heard so many stories about states or a major health system ordering supplies only to have the federal government confiscate it at the border and put it into the stockpile, and then have the United States say the stockpile isn't for the states, it's for us, whoever us is. So we have had a totally misguided and inappropriate response. We need a national plan in place right away. We will only get that, I would say, with a new president who has made it very clear that he will have a national plan. And for vaccine distribution, for vaccine integration, for vaccine communication, we need that national plan to start right away. People have to have confidence in the safety and security. But beyond that, we need some transparency. Where is the vaccine going? How will it be available? Who gets it first? How many people? Again, that whole effort has been pushed to the states. States are submitting plans, but we need a national strategy for how this is going to roll out and how we can have confidence in, when the FDA says we have a safe candidate, that has not been pushed ahead, shoved ahead, or that the guidelines for the FDA, which have always been the gold standard in the world, have not been shortened or rushed due to political pressures.
Well, thank you for that. I can't even think of the number of business leaders, pharmaceutical industry leaders, scientists I've talked to since this pandemic began. And I think one of the interesting things is, while you saw a lot of society freeze up and get worried about drugs, therapeutics, et cetera, The other side of it is that a lot of the companies, beyond political control, bent over backwards to make sure that there were eventually no shortages in supplies. And so to ask, okay, what's the right way forward? In a few minutes, I'm going to be having Representative Alyssa Slotkin on. She passed legislation on strengthening America's strategic national stockpile to begin looking at that. And again, as somebody who had purview of what the private sector is doing, what the federal government needs to do, but what are some of the parts of the skeletal structure you think we need to amp up other than the national plan? But how do you look at the ecosystem and what you think is wobbly right now that needs to be shorn up?
Well, I think it's going to be hugely important, Steve, to do a really in-depth after-action report. We did that after H1N1 and found, for instance, that we didn't have sufficient manufacturing capacity in the U.S. for vaccines. So new contracts were let. We now have, I think, tripled the production capacity. That's good news. I think putting back in place the responsive red flag folks, national security and within the White House are going to be critical. But I think we need to figure out what of the protective equipment supplies and gowns and gloves should we actually make here in the United States? What makes sense? How we actually have production capacity here to deal with a global issue when everybody in the world is trying to find equipment and supplies at the same time. I think we're going to need a renewed confidence in public-private partnerships. Pharma has really stepped up. But what we know about stockpiles, and particularly stockpiles for therapeutics and vaccines, is unless the government has a pot of money and says to pharma, it's worth your time to invest in the science, to manufacture these drugs, to bring them to development, if there isn't a willing buyer, it doesn't happen. We're facing a possibility of antimicrobial resistance to antibiotics. We don't have a big pipeline of antibiotics in this country. So that's an example where with a government pool of money that happened after 9/11, and we had massive resources for making sure that America was safe and secure, which means some of the supplies that will be developed are never used, hopefully, are never put into action, but you have them in place of something happening. We need to be willing to fund proactively and not reactively.
Secretary, just real quickly, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being worst, 1 being best, how bad was the administration's response so far in COVID?
I think it's bad. I think the deaths that we are seeing in the United States are unparalleled for a developed country with the resources that we have. The burden on the Black and brown community and Native American communities is immoral, that we didn't move much more quickly and tell people the truth and really take the steps to secure the most vulnerable populations. So I think we're at about a 9. Maybe we can recover some territory with vaccine development and distribution, but there is no reason in the world that we should have had this many deaths. And now we still have almost 1,000 people a day dying. And the virus, Steve, I'm in the middle of the country in a rural state. The virus is raging here, and it's raging in communities that have almost no capacity to deal with it because there aren't ICU beds, there isn't the equipment, and there isn't the personnel.
Well, Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, I really am grateful every time we get a chance to talk, but it's also very sobering every time I talk to you. So thank you so much for joining us today and helping us to launch our program.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Our next guest believes that stockpiling medical supplies made in the U.S. is an issue of real national security. Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat from Michigan, she's running for election right now, joins me now. I can't tell you how grateful, Representative Slotkin, you are with us just a week out from all this other stuff you have going on. But I know this is a priority for you, and it's a priority for the country. So just be point blank. What's broken that needs to be fixed?
Well, listen, a lot of my experience in sort of the worst of it in March and April really came down to the fact that things like medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, just major supply chains that help keep us safe were just so outsourced to places like China, we couldn't get a hold of them when we really needed them. And my experience in the Pentagon and in the national security world, that it kind of blew my mind that while we still really have a preference for making things in America on, our military equipment, our body armor, our meals ready to eat, we didn't have the same Buy American requirements on other things like medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. Obviously, the stockpile, we opened that sucker up and a lot of it was expired. Here in Michigan, we got moldy stuff, a lot less than what we were expecting. So we have to make sure that there's a better way to stockpile equipment when we need it. And then in general, I think it just really combines kind of my national security background with sort of major American manufacturing. And, here in Michigan, we've been saying for 30 years that if you outsource too far, you're going to get caught with your pants down at some point. And I feel like we did. If I'm haggling with a Chinese middleman in the middle of the night for a 78-cent mask, like something has gone wrong. So that's been the focus of our work since basically April.
Where does your legislation now that I just mentioned with Secretary Sebelius strengthening America's strategic national stockpile? I've talked to some other industry leaders that are in pharmaceutical production, and they've been talking about, look, you can identify the top 100 most needed, therapies and medicines that are out there and figure this out, that it's doable. Where does this stand now?
Sure. So it's actually a series of 7 bills, completely bipartisan, 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans, built purposely bipartisan because this issue should be bipartisan. They all passed the House in September. And now we're in negotiation to have them in the next COVID package, this thing that Mnuchin and Pelosi have been struggling to negotiate. Those bills are in there. And my hope is once we get past the election, we're actually able to get something done. I've been frustrated that we haven't before the election. It's something that, frankly, we should be moving on now. And the biggest part of it is this $500 million pilot program for public-private partnerships on extra lines, particularly extra pharmaceutical lines, for the very thing you were mentioning. When we need to surge and go, the American government has an interest in being partners on additional surge capacity. So that's the part I'm most excited about.
Have you talked to industry leaders? How do they feel in terms of their partnership with government and in terms of what they know is going to be a big lift, a big load of new vaccines and therapeutics that's going to have to be deployed pretty to every corner of the country? Are you finding them to be robust partners? Is it a good track, or do you have concerns?
Well, listen, we have one of these companies that's now being sort of at the ready for when the vaccine is identified. They're ready to go and ramp up in production here in my district, Endo. But we've been talking to them and others about, everyone talks about manufacturing more in the United States, but you have to make sure you're talking to the industry to figure out what truly incentivizes people, right? You can't just decide from Washington that what's going to, bring manufacturing back. We have such a globalized supply chain. We have such an ecosystem that there's a ton of things that they come from all parts of the globe. And it's more than just saying, come on back. So what I want to really do is hear from our business leaders. And I was in this great group called Business Executives for National Security. They've done an after action on our supply chains. And I was one of the members of that commission that looked at it. You got to really talk to the leaders in industry to figure out how you properly incentivize additional production in the United States. It can't be made up from Washington.
One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is your CIA background, your background as an analyst. I happened to talk earlier this week to Rick Bright. Rick Bright was the BARDA official who said that he was pushed out of that job. He recently left government and came in, and he said something, and it's on Alex Gibney's new show on the COVID crisis called Totally Under Control, that I didn't realize. I mean, a lot of people look back to a playbook that was developed during the Obama period that was there on the shelf, but they did a simulation. You did simulations in the CIA. You did exercises in October of 2019 that anticipated this kind of pandemic, that looked at all the government responses, that looked at partnership with industry, and that actually underscored the very weaknesses in decision that we saw. Is there any awareness that playbook, that not the playbook, but that simulation occurred, highlighting many of these gaps? among your colleagues in Congress and the need to fill them? Because I was astonished to hear that the Trump administration already had this experience in hand.
I don't know how widespread and that knowledge is, but I certainly, and anyone with a national security background from any administration knows that there are people in each administration who look at these kinds of scenarios for a living. I mean, they have a whole Homeland Security Council at the White House. I know people who are working over there, and I know that there are people who were focused on this. It's a difference between having folks in the system who look at this problem set and then having it rise to the level of senior leaders where they're going to do something about it. And the most important thing in dealing with the federal response is intent. Do you have the will and intent to lead from the White House or lead from Washington? And I think it was this paralysis that came from sort of not wanting to accept the gravity of the problem, not wanting to accept that the federal government actually was the best place to respond in a lot of these scenarios. Those two things meant that we just got way too late of a start. And while this kind of thing would have stretched any administration of any party, the fact that they backed away from that leadership role meant that they didn't even seek out the expertise that might have already been in their administration.
What are the other critical supplies that you think the nation needs, and what would some of the partnership with the private sector look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think we actually need to do a soup to nuts look at what are the supply chains with the national security value. I got to tell you, as someone who, is from Michigan, where obviously we're never far from thinking about vehicles and vehicle production, there's certain batteries, certain capacity around energy storage that we depend on a lot of other countries for, that we don't want to do without. There's certainly a lot of technology around superconductors that we're at risk of, having to depend on other countries. Well, we actually think we need, and I wrote this into the Defense Department budget through my role in the Armed Services Committee, is a soup to nuts look and identification of the very specific, supply chains with national security importance. And then once we identify that list, we can look at incentivizing more production here at home. But we got to agree upon that list, right? We have to have a common understanding and be able to review it every few years.
Right.
But certainly energy storage is a big one that we would be loath to live without.
Well, Representative Elissa Slotkin, I really appreciate your insights and what you're doing to think through this ecosystem of how to be smarter than perhaps we have been. So I'm really grateful for your time. I know how busy you are, and so thanks for joining us for today's program.
Thanks so much.
My next guest has been a pharmacist for 30 years and is the only pharmacist in Congress. He thinks the coronavirus is the wake-up call America needs to bring back the pharmaceutical supply chain to the United States. Welcome, Congressman Earl Buddy Carter, a Georgia Republican, up for election in a few days again, re-election. Buddy, thank you for taking time to talk to us about this. I just said it. You think that this ought to be a wake-up call. What needles do we need to move to make sure that America has the supply chain, something it can trust to deal with this pandemic?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And to your point, I've always said there's a difference in knowing something and realizing something. I think we've known for quite a while that we were too dependent on other countries for our pharmaceutical needs. But during this pandemic, we've realized it. And having realized it means that we have to do something about it. And one of the things that we are proposing and that I have legislation is called the MAID Act. It's Manufacturing Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients, Drugs, and Excipients in the U.S. And what we're trying to do is to attract some of these pharmaceutical manufacturers that are located out of our country back into our country. You know that 90% of all the ibuprofen in the world is made in China. 90% of our antibiotics come from foreign countries. That's not a good situation for us to be in. I'm reminded of the late 70s when we realized that we were dependent on the Middle East for our energy needs, and we realized that we needed to have energy independence, and we achieved that. The same thing can be said now. We realized that we're too dependent on foreign countries for our pharmaceutical needs, and we need to do something about it. We need to have pharmaceutical independence. That's why with this legislation, what I'm trying to do is to attract those companies to come back to America, to try to incentivize them and to repatriate them back to America through the use of opportunity zones. You'll remember that opportunity zones were created through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that will actually be a tax credit that these companies can get if they will locate their manufacturing facilities in these areas. We use other incentives as well, tax incentives, not the least of which is trying to browbeat them and appeal to their patriotism that we need you to come back in America. That's very important. Pharmaceutical independence, not only pharmaceutical independence, but also with PPE. We're too dependent on these foreign countries for our PPE, for our personal protective equipment. We need to make sure we're doing manufacturing here in America with that, with PPE as well.
Well, Congressman, one of the interesting things as I've kind of delved into this, and I'm glad you made a distinction between PPE and the kind of the pharmaceutical side. The PPEs, we clearly saw, the law of the jungle. But if you kind of look and you peel back, I think there was a sense of anxiety and crisis about pharmaceuticals, about dependence. But when you got into it, I can't find anywhere where they weren't delivered, that the supply chain largely worked through this time. And I'm just wondering if my bearings are off somewhat, because, and I know that you're working on what our national stockpile of this should be and how we should look at what the key medicines and therapies ought to be. But I guess when we looked at the actual experience, did things hold together or not?
Well, certainly we had threats, and fortunately they didn't come to fruition, but we had threats from China. It said, yeah, we're glad to send you this medication. We're going to use what we have to use first, and if there's anything left over, then we'll send it to you. That's not the kind of situation we need to be in. That's not in the best interest of the healthcare of our citizens, nor is it in the best interest of our national defense. That's just a situation that we should avoid, and we can avoid. We do need to get pharmaceutical manufacturers. The same thing with the PPE. You've seen, yes, we've been able to basically get everything that we need, but at what price? The price has gone up enormously. We've heard of price gouging that has been happening from foreign countries, and that's again why we need to address this.
I've talked to leaders in industry, the pharmaceutical and therapeutics manufacturers, and I think they're interested in kind of partnering with government on things like looking at the strategic stockpile, like doing this. But they said in terms of onshoring or re-onshoring some of this capacity that's moved abroad, it requires a kind of whole of economy system. You've got to have long-term purchasing. You've got to have regulatory changes. You mentioned opportunity zones. And I guess my question to you, is there a place in our government that's thinking holistically about that environment? Because they said if it's done piecemeal, it won't work.
Well, you're absolutely right. We've got to make it worth their while. We understand that. One thing that we have trouble competing with is labor costs. And there are going to have to be other incentives in there to make sure that we cover that part of it. And that's why it's important that it is holistic, as you point out. We can't piecemeal this to make it work. And we understand that. That's why this legislation that I've introduced, again, addresses all of those different things. And also, there are some pharmaceutical manufacturers that are located here in the United States already. And a lot of them have been asking the question, well, what about me? Am I going to get incentives as well? Yes, there'll be incentives in there to attract them to remain here in America. So that's very important and certainly something we have considered. If I could talk just a second about the stockpile, because you've mentioned that a couple of times. I also have two pieces of legislation that I think are very important to address our stockpile. We all know that we've got a federal stockpile, a federal strategic stockpile, but we've recognized that we've been too dependent on that. So I've got legislation, and it is bipartisan legislation, by the way, that I'm co-sponsoring along with Lisa Rochester Blunt from Delaware, a Democrat, to address our state strategic stockpiles. And what this is a matching grant. It's a dollar-for-dollar grant to encourage states to have their own stockpile. What we found out during this pandemic was that we were all too dependent on the national stockpile and that states didn't have what they should have had in place. Well, this is a pilot program, as I say, that will offer grants to encourage states to have their own stockpiles. That's very important. That'll help us be even better prepared for the next time. Another bill I want to tell you about, again, I'm co-sponsoring with Representative Rochester, is the essential medicine stockpile. And what this does is that, 90% of all the drugs that are used are generic drugs. And instead of waiting till we have a shortage of a generic drug, and then stockpiling it, we actually create the essential medicines that we know we're going to need. And again, this is a pilot program, a 3-year pilot program, whereas we create this national stockpile of essential medicines, and we utilize the ideas that are being currently utilized in the private sector of perpetual inventories and making sure that we have an inventory of these essential medicines so that if there is a shortage at any given time, we'll be able to have them on hand for our citizens. That's very important. And again, by using that perpetual inventory, we can guard against a lot of it going out of date and being wasted. I can remember when I was in the Georgia State Legislature in the State Senate, and we went through the bird flu, and we bought millions of dollars worth of Tamiflu to make sure, and it was the right decision back then, but to make sure that we had it for our citizens. It ended up going out of date, and we didn't have to use it, which was a good thing, but
right.
We ended up just wasting it. Well, through the new policies that we can get from in the new procedures that we can get from the private sector using perpetual inventory, we can avoid that.
I know we've got a question from the audience community, but just want to squeeze one more in. I know your role as a pharmacist. Now, I may have this wrong, but in my mind, pharmacists are kind of like, in some ways, the canary in the coal mine. They know what the inflow, outflow is. Are there things that we should know about the pharmacists and what role they can play, or amping up their role in terms of alerts and what the flow and need is out there of various key pharmaceuticals?
Well, that's a great question, because pharmacists are the most accessible healthcare professionals in America. 95% of all Americans live within 5 miles of a pharmacist. And I've felt for a long time that we're not utilizing pharmacists in particular, but a number of healthcare professionals to the top of their license. And I've discussed this with Dr. Adams, with the Department of Public Health, with Secretary Azar, with HHS, Administrator Verma, and they all agree we need to be utilizing these pharmacists, not only in situations as you described, where we see a shortage of different drugs and we can warn about it, but also as we're going through this COVID-19 pandemic, being able to test for this, being able to administer the vaccines. Most people are getting their vaccines from a pharmacy now, from a pharmacist, and we need to be able to administer the COVID-19 vaccine. That's going to help us to get it out to the people as quickly as possible and as safely as possible.
Well, thank you for that. We've been taking questions from the audience, and we have one now from Buddy. Buddy?
I'm Kevin Donnelly, CEO of TCPI in Chicago. What's the appetite of industry providers and the current and potential administration for the added costs and challenges of onshoring more of our pharmaceutical supply chain?
So, great question. Question is, are we willing to pay for it?
Well, that is a great question. And, I don't think the question is, are we willing to pay for it? We have to pay for it. We've got to be prepared for this. And I think that we all agree that this is necessary, and that in order to attract these companies back to America, we've got to be competitive. These are private companies, and the primary reason they went offshore in the first place was financial incentives, whether it be lower manufacturing costs, lower labor costs, or whatever it is. We in America, we're going to have to bite the bullet, and we're just going to have to step up to the plate and do what we have to do. I think we recognize that now.
Buddy, I know I follow you on Twitter, so I know that you are, right now, you've signed up for a vaccine trial, and you've said you're going to sign up. You believe we're going to come up with a safe and effective vaccine. And, I just want to wish you well in that. I hope it goes well, because I really like folks that stand up. It's an important time. So how's it going so far?
Well, so far it's going very well. And I did start and had my first dose. And in about 3 weeks, I'll get my second dose. I don't know whether it's a placebo or the real thing. The doctor doesn't know. The staff doesn't know. None of it's a double-blind study. Only the number on the vial, whoever's got that key, will know whether it's a placebo or the vaccine. But I keep a diary, a daily diary of symptoms, of how I'm feeling that day, what my temperature is. Listen, I believe that it's important as a member of the healthcare profession, as a member of Congress, for me to put my money where my mouth is. And that's why I'm very confident that we're going to have a safe and effective vaccine, so confident that I'm willing to go through the process myself.
Well, if your blood pressure and temperature went up right now, you can blame in your journal Steve Clemens of the Hill. But Representative Buddy Carter, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got a lot on your plate right now with the election just around the corner. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The United States just reported the most new COVID-19 cases in 1 week since the pandemic began. Infection rates are skyrocketing as we enter the colder months. Now joined by Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner under President Trump and resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Gottlieb has been advising lawmakers and governors on their response to the public health crisis. And if you're like me and you're up at 6 a.m. and clicking on CNBC, you can get really, really smart on all things COVID. Scott, it's great to see you again. You know, I've often, this is going to be unfair to you and perhaps to some of your colleagues, but I often ask, I'm listening to you on CNBC and Squawk Box, and I'm just saying, God, if it was at the FDA, would any of this be better? And so my question to you, perhaps unfair, is, I look at some of this and I see a lot of Keystone Cop stuff. What do you see has been strong and good and capable about our response thus far on COVID that you think someone like me is missing?
Well, thanks for having me. I think the process that CBER has been following, particularly with respect to the vaccines, and as you know, I'm on the board of Pfizer, one of the companies that has a vaccine in advanced development. So I have a perspective on that, both, from my former position at FDA and as someone who follows the news, as well as someone who sits in that role. I think the process that CBER has been following, Peter Marks, has been very rigorous, very transparent. I think it has a lot of integrity to it. And so I think that has gone well. The fact that they're bringing these products before an advisory committee, the fact that they outlined objective criteria in multiple guidance documents, I think the criteria makes sense. They're not too conservative. They're not too aggressive. I think they struck a sort of the right middle path there, recognizing that this is a crisis, but they still need to make sure they have rigorous data on which they're basing these decisions. The fact that they had that advisory committee this past week where they brought that criteria to an advisory committee and had a public discussion around it. So I think that has gone very well. I think some of the bigger challenges when history looks back at this are going to be related to a number of things, but the one that I come back to is the diagnostics and the fact that we were situationally blind back in January and February and really didn't have diagnostics deployed. And I've written about this many times. I wrote about it at the time as well. And I think when you look back at, sort of where were the things that we could have done differently that might have had an effect on the contours of the epidemic that ensued, that would be one of them. And the key was not just getting the CDC test out, which a lot of people point to, but getting the clinical labs in the game, getting Quest and LabCorp and BioReference labs and large academic labs in the game early back in January, recognizing that it would take them, a month or so to ramp up their capacity. You had to get them started early on that.
When you look at the drug and therapeutics line, one of the interesting questions we're looking at today is the supply chain working? Does it need to be moved? But we're also talking about, the very fast development of new vaccines and new therapies. I've talked to any number of CEOs, including from Pfizer and others, but there's this a question of new stuff coming online and whether the system can handle it and the deployment of vaccines, but also what we saw in terms of drugs and therapies already. Did you have any concerns about that? Did the system largely work?
Well, look, I think people talk about the speed at which we develop these products, and it's true we developed them quickly, but we actually didn't shortcut the development process. The reason why we were able to pivot into getting products into the clinic very quickly is because we had these established platforms that we were able to use to start deriving drug constructs and vaccine constructs based on the gene sequence alone. We happened to have the mRNA platforms. They were reasonably far along. Pfizer, for example, was using that platform to develop a flu vaccine. Moderna had used it to try to develop a vaccine against SARS and was using it for other purposes. And so the technology was far along. And so once you had the gene sequence from the coronavirus, you're able to insert it and start deriving drug constructs. Same with the antibody-based drugs. We had those platforms available. We had developed antibodies against other viruses, including Ebola and Ebola and MERS in the case of Regeneron. And so we were able to quickly take those platforms and get drugs into development. The development programs are actually quite extensive. We didn't take any shortcuts there. The fact that Pfizer is doing a 44,000 patient trial, J&J is doing a 60,000 patient trial, Moderna is doing a 30,000 patient trial. These will be the largest vaccine clinical trials ever undertaken simultaneously against a single target. And some of them will be almost the largest trials ever undertaken. I think the rotavirus vaccine was over 60,000 patients, but most vaccine trials are not this large, and the randomized portion isn't this large. And so these are very big development programs. We did not shortcut this at all. Where we did move with speed is getting the products into development. In many respects, that's reflected by the fact that these products aren't commercially optimized. If you had 2 years to develop a vaccine or 3 years to develop a vaccine, would you develop a vaccine that requires 2 doses, or would you try to optimize it into a single dose? You try to optimize it and get a single dose vaccine. If you had a lot of time to develop a vaccine, would you develop a vaccine that requires special storage in cold conditions? No, you would try to manufacture it in ways that it could be stored at room temperature. So we didn't optimize it from that standpoint, but in terms of the actual development programs, they're extensive. And I think that needs to be understood. We really didn't take any shortcuts, and the FDA didn't take any shortcuts. And this was really driven by the regulators in terms of the data that they were requesting. As far as the supply chain is concerned, I think the challenges are with respect to the supply that's going to be available. And in some cases, we're supply constrained just because it takes time to ramp up supply. I think in other cases, we're going to be supply constrained because we didn't take all of the steps we could have taken at the outset to try to provide for more supply. And that's particularly true with the antibody-based drugs, where I've long lamented that we didn't push harder to expand supply. I think the companies did a lot of work, some really extraordinary work, but there's probably more that we could have done collectively as a federal government to try to provide for more supply of those drugs and use them as a bridge to a vaccine. As far as the distribution is concerned, I think there's going to be complexity with how these drugs are getting distributed because of the policy choices that we're making in terms of how we're doing that. But as far as the logistics are concerned, I think the logistics and the distributors have done a really good job in this crisis, and it shows you how good the logistics are in this country when it comes to medical products. I mean, when the supplies were there, they were able to distribute them. The reason why there were shortages wasn't because things weren't showing up on time, it was just because there wasn't enough material.
So I'm hearing what you're saying is the distributors have their act together, but there needs to be a plan. Kathleen Sebelius was on our program just a short while ago and says she's waiting for a national plan. I know that you talked to Governor Larry Hogan, one of my favorite governors in the country, Maryland, and other governors as well. But in Alex Gibney's new film called Totally Under Control, there's Larry Hogan, welcoming a package of PPE from South Korea and trying to prevent it from being hijacked by federal authorities that might have taken it. So it was a kind of law of the jungle feeling in that moment. And so, you ask yourself, as we're, getting closer and closer to multiple potential vaccines, how do you preempt that same story from occurring again?
Well, I think that the vaccine distribution system that they've created, based on my understanding of it, is going to exert a lot of control over how the vaccines are distributed. First of all, the supply that the states are going to get based on an allocation system that's tied to what the initial authorizations are for. So states are going to get a sort of proportionate allocation based on how many people they have in their state that meet the criteria. So, if the vaccine's authorized for everyone over the age of 65, let's just say hypothetically, and I'm not saying that's what it's going to be, I really don't know, other than what's been disclosed by ACIP and the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That's, 55, 60 million people. If you only have 30 million doses, then every state gets a proportion of that 30 million based on how many people they have over the age of 65. That's the system as it's been designed. But the system goes further in that they're going to have very tight tracking of where all the doses are going and who they're being administered to inside the states. And so that allows the federal government to reach in and reallocate vaccine at any point. And it also allows them to make sure that it's going to properly indicated populations, although they're giving discretion to the states to make the final choice on who would get it. But the price you pay for that level of control and oversight is that you have to distribute it through a more narrow chain. So they're going to have close monitoring of what the sites are. The sites need to be registered. They need to undergo special training. And so that limits the number of sites that you can distribute through. Hopefully there'll be enough sites in underserved communities and be enough sites that are accessible to people who have difficulty, coming into a CVS or coming into a vaccine distribution point that's adjacent to a hospital, maybe standing in line. That's where you start to be concerned that people who already have obstacles getting access to it, if you're creating some friction in the system, they're the ones who are going to be most disadvantaged. And so how do you offset that? If you're a governor, you try to create mobile vans that maybe go around. That costs money. Is there federal money for that? It's not clear. So those are the places where I would be focusing some attention on, places where some incremental friction is going to create some obstacles. It could be that getting a COVID vaccine, at least for that initial tranche, is a lot like going to vote, where you have to go to a special location in a special window to get your vaccine. And for most people, that could be okay, but you worry about people who have obstacles to access. As far as the antibodies are concerned, there again, you're going to be supply limited. But the way the system's being designed right now, based on my understanding, is that they plan to distribute those drugs through hospital emergency rooms. And the challenge there is that, again, if the initially indicated population is older individuals, a lot of people already are reluctant to get infusions of antibodies. We know that from the commercial side of the drug market. People perceive swallowing a pill as something that is less consequential than going and getting an infusion of a drug. And that's why a lot of primary care drugs are formulated in ways that they're not infusions, because people inherently look at an infusion as more invasive, as potentially more risky. And so you have that sort of bias in the system, if you will, in terms of how consumers perceive it. And now you have a situation where those antibodies need to be delivered right after you get sick, right when either before symptoms come on or just as you become symptomatic, and you have to deliver them quickly. They're most effective the earlier they're delivered. So you have to convince an older individual who's not that sick yet, but has coronavirus diagnosis, to go into an emergency room and sit for a 45-minute infusion with a 2-hour follow-up. And there's probably going to be other wait time. And you're probably in a location where coronavirus is already epidemic, or else they wouldn't have caught it in the first place. And therefore, the emergency room is going to be very busy. And someone's got to drive them there. So someone's got to take them to the emergency room and potentially expose themselves to coronavirus. That's a challenging distribution system, not as it was designed and as it's being conceived, based on my understanding. I wrote about this with Mark McClellan in the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago. We advocated maybe using home infusion as an alternative, or offering it as a alternative, but it doesn't seem to be the direction they're going in. So I think that that's going to be another challenge. So just to sort of sum up, I think where you want to look for challenges is places where you create friction or difficulties that patients who already have obstacles getting into the doctor, getting into the emergency room, getting access to a provider site, it's going to be extra friction for that individual, and you want to try to find ways to mitigate that. You have to look at it from the patient's perspective and recognize you're dealing with patients that sometimes face even more obstacles getting access to care because they're older, because they come from communities where they don't have good access to healthcare or good resources available to them.
I really appreciate that perspective, Scott. We're basically out of time, but I just ask you real quickly, because you talk to everybody on every side of the aisle of this, and you know what's possible. You tweeted out recently that you thought it was time for a national mask mandate. Do you see any way that leading Republicans and leading Democrats might come together and say, given the dark winter we're looking at potentially, that this might be the right time?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how you would enforce a national mandate. I think that there are Republicans that are on board with trying to promote mask wearing. And I think that there's ways you could provide carrots rather than just sticks to try to prod governors to implement those mandates. Certainly, if you made it more culturally acceptable, that would be a very big start. And so, the bully pulpit is very powerful. And I think if it was used in a way to try to encourage governors to do this, that would go a very long way instead of what we have right now, which is in some cases the opposite, where masks are being discouraged in some respect. Remember, the masks are to prevent asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people from being able to transmit the virus. They can also offer you protection as an individual, but their quality of mask matters, and the higher the quality of the mask that you're wearing, the more protection it's going to afford you.
Well, thank you. Well, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former commissioner of the FDA and my favorite voice in the early mornings on CNBC. Great to see you, and also resident scholar at AEI. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, Scott.
Thanks a lot.
And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get going, a quick clarification. While I'm conducting this interview and the questions are mine, the content of this portion shouldn't be considered editorial. With that, I'd really like to welcome my friend Chip Davis, President and CEO of the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. Great backdrop there, Chip. I like that. It's good. Thank you. I hope you're enjoying today's program, and thank you for supporting it. But let me ask you the same question I've asked a number of people, because there are different polls in this. There's distribution of drugs and therapies we've had line. We have new drugs and therapies that are potentially coming online to address this. How is that distribution network doing in terms of managing those stress points?
Yeah, Steve, first of all, thanks for the question, and more importantly to you and the Hill for running this event today, obviously for all the perspective that you're getting. Very timely discussion given where we are in the midst of this pandemic. In terms of sort of assessing where we have been, and I want to be clear when I say that, I'm not talking about some sort of after action review here, because as you and other experts have noted on this call, we're right in the midst of it. Look at the numbers, as you said, over the last couple of days. But actually earlier this week, the HDA Foundation issued a report on how the pharmaceutical supply chain responded within the first 90 days. And to sum that up, I will tell you that the pharmaceutical supply chain was stretched and it bent, but it did not break. And I think you alluded to earlier the fact that pharmacy shelves, by and large, remained filled during the early days of COVID-19. Compare that by way of example to some other supply chains, whether it was in the food stores, the paper products aisle being empty. Sometimes people were put on processes where they could only go to the food store based upon the first name of the first letter of their last name. So by and large, the pharmaceutical supply chain has been very, very resilient. And I think that's a credit to everybody that's involved in it, from the frontline manufacturers, certainly to the frontline providers and the healthcare heroes there, both in the physician, provider, and pharmacy communities. But it also had a lot to do with our members, who really are, if you look at the global supply chain as sort of a wheel, we're the spoke of the wheel. We connect 1,300 manufacturers, our members at HDA, to over 180,000 providers. And I think if you look at our role in ensuring that resiliency, it comes down to three things that I would submit. The first being the level of partnership that we have, both with front-end manufacturers and frontline providers. Secondarily, the logistical expertise that you've heard about through some of the speakers today that distributors possess, really as the skeleton of the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. There is so much data and so much expertise that they apply on a regular basis to move millions and millions of prescriptions every single day to the healthcare system. And lastly, I would say, it is the experiences, the prior experiences. Our members have been there every step of the way during things like natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, other climate-related events, that as COVID hit early on, as you remember, there were hot spots, and it allowed our members to respond to those areas of the country that were seeing surges like New York, New Jersey, and certain areas of the West Coast, and actually be able to move product from areas that weren't experiencing the surge to those areas that were, in an effort to ensure that everybody had access to the medicine they need.
Chip, in anticipation of this program today and my conversation with you, I sort of tried to delve into some of your members, how this thing works, because you sometimes lose some of the magic when you talk about logistics and supply chains and plays over. But it's extraordinary when you look at the amount of material that your members move under conditions of controlled temperatures, sometimes very, when we see vaccines come on, cold storage distribution, which is complex, expiration dates, prescriptions, et cetera, in kind of that broad array. So it's not just a kind of mass bulky move. There's a high level of precision in it. And I guess my question is, when something like this happens, does the economics work out? Do you have the resources you need? Are the partnerships with state and federal governments what they need to be to keep that healthy and strong? and complexly robust?
Yeah, Steve, so I would respond to your question really in two ways, is that if you look at what our members have done, I would summarize it over the past several months as being incredibly adaptable to the moving pieces in dealing with the pandemic, and then ensuring a level of robust communications within the context of a public-private partnership. I think the adaptation is consistent with what I just alluded to in making sure that as hotspots came on the radar, many of our members were the first ones to identify based upon the data they have, and they actually gave heads up to both the federal government, who we as an association and our members were in contact with every single day, multiple times a day, as you might imagine, places like FEMA, CDC, HHS, and FDA, as well as the state governments for obvious reasons. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure as we move forward was that we were actually sort of memorializing and putting into regular practice a level of communication that I think led to the fact that as we begin to look towards vaccine distribution, that the federal government has identified utilizing the expertise that distributors bring to the table on a daily basis to ensure that as the vaccines come online, that the distribution industry is going to be there to play a significant role in getting those vaccines to the patients who need it.
When it comes to adapting, and from the experience we've seen so far, but looking ahead, what are some of those things that your members are preparing to do when it comes to the potential vaccines we might have?
So I think it's several. As you might imagine, they're in regular communication with the companies, many of whom you've heard about today, who are in the development phase right now, and making sure that they understand all the requirements that, as you just alluded to as well, some of them obviously have traditional cold chain or even ultra cold chain requirements. And so it's important for distributors to be aware of that, not once the vaccine's approved, but as the vaccines are in development. So staying in close contact on the front end with the manufacturing and development community. I think on the back end as well is making sure that talking to the states, given the responsibility that they have, and as you know, all the states are in the process of submitting their vaccine plans to the federal government by November 1st. So I think we're seeing trend lines there, both in terms of consistencies that the states are saying in terms of ensuring their needs are met, and also identifying some potential outlier issues that may need to be addressed. It's that constant importance of making sure that there's a public-private communication on a regular basis. We've actually put out a series of principles for vaccine distribution that highlight the importance of the public-private sector partnership, but also, to your underlying question, ensuring that there is as much robust and strategic communication between the federal government and state governments as we come closer to vaccines being approved.
Chip, we have a question for you from our audience, but I'm going to sneak in one more, which is,
Sure.
One of the questions I've been asking people for really the last 6 months is, what can we do today that prepares us well for the next emergency? I know we've got waves of COVID still coming, and that's our current obsession, but what are we doing now to kind of, build infrastructure so that we're not caught so off guard the next time? And I know that you talk to your members about this, about what we can do to better prepare for the next public health emergency. What would be some of the things on your list?
So there's sort of two things, Steve, to that point that jump to mind to me. Is one, as we move forward with an eye back towards the March-April timeframe, the coordination by the day and by the week got better within the federal government, but I think it's going to be really important to take away from this. And I think Secretary Sebelius mentioned this at the beginning of the program, the sort of, when we get to that point, hopefully sometime sooner rather than later, when we start doing the after-action analysis, I think the coordinated, centralized aspect of command will be really, really important as a key takeaway from this. And I think we've gotten there, but as everybody was coming to terms with so much uncertainty in the early part of this, that was an area with the benefit of hindsight that I think that could be improved upon. And I think the other aspect is just recognizing that in order to do this, to maximize the value of ensuring access to the treatments, the therapeutics, and the vaccines, it's going to be to leverage the expertise that already exists within the healthcare supply chain, whether it be the distributors and our expertise that we have, or the manufacturers, is to be really, really cautious about thinking about any alternative distribution channels that would require a significant amount of upfront investing and time frame that, quite frankly, we will not have the time for if we actually get to a place where we're dealing with other natural disasters or pandemics in the future.
Thank you for that. Well, Chip, I have a question from the audience, which I think is a great question. I'm going to pose it to you. So let's hear from Brad. Brad?
Hi, I'm Brad Trom, owner of Brad Trom Pharmacy Consulting. located in Brentwood, Tennessee. I'd like you to discuss the detailed logistics of the COVID-19 vaccine distribution and where the vaccine might be administered for the general public, whether it's in clinics or pharmacies or mass vaccination events. Thank you very much.
Great question. Scott Gottlieb got into this a little bit, but it's a great question. So how do you see this rolling out? Because your members are going to be doing this.
Very, very true, and thank you for the question. I think there's a couple of aspects of this right out of the gate that are going to be important. First is, obviously, as the first vaccine or the first and second waves of the vaccine get approved, we're going to be talking about millions of doses for hundreds of millions and ultimately billions of people across the planet. So what's going to be really, really important is making sure that we have direction from the government. And again, this goes back to sort of the importance of that regular daily communication in the public-private partnership of understanding what the expectations will be, the direction of both federal and state governments as to where those doses are to be delivered and distributed, understanding the sensitive populations, the elderly, the vulnerable, those with pre-existing conditions. Obviously, we want to make sure that frontline healthcare providers are taken care of, and we anticipate that there will be a significant amount of public health facilities utilized as vaccines come on board to ensure not just the effective distribution, but ultimately, as we like to say, the goal for us is to turn vaccines into vaccinations. And that's what our members are very much focused on. And I think engaging with the public health institutions and entities, both at the federal level, the state, and the local level, particularly as we see areas that will probably be focused on with a higher degree based upon the spread rate, is something that we'll be very, very focused on as we continue to move forward, working with both the manufacturers and the government.
Well, Chip Davis, President and CEO of Healthcare Distribution Alliance, this was an important set of discussions today. I'm very grateful to HDA and to you for supporting the program, but also for such a smart conversation. So thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Steve, as always. Thank you.
My next guests have a deep understanding of our healthcare ecosystem and its infrastructure. I'm delighted to have them on to discuss not only the resiliency of our pharmaceutical supply chain, but also their recommendations for a seamless rollout of the coronavirus vaccine when it becomes available. Dr. Elena Rios is the president and CEO of the National Hispanic Medical Association. Dr. Joshua Sharfstein is professor of the practice in health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Heather Zank is senior vice president of strategic global sourcing at AmerisourceBergen Corporation. Thank you all for joining us. Heather, let me start with you. I think one of the reasons we're doing this program today is that Americans are anxious. They're anxious about what's going on in the country, the stress out there. They're anxious by what they've seen with regard to some of the management of, PPE in the past. And there's concern about how a virus vaccine is going to roll out and the various therapeutics for it. So I guess my question to you is just take off the corporate hat for a minute, but should Americans be anxious about some parts of this, or should they have confidence that the system is going to work?
I think Americans should have confidence the system's going to work. We have lifelong medical staff. We have lifelong resources that have done this kind of work over and over again. I think what is unprecedented, which is another term we use very frequently during these times, but truthful in this example, it is unprecedented that we're looking to vaccinate the entire United States population in a short amount of time. I think with that unprecedented effort comes a strong supply chain that wants to support it. I think you have healthcare professionals. We all want to get back to more of a normal lifestyle. I want to see my family. I know many of us would enjoy spending the holidays together, which may not happen this holiday season, but let's look forward to next holiday season. And I think what you need to rely upon here is you have a sophisticated, robust supply chain that can do this in the United States. And I think what some of the uncertainty is coming around is now we're hearing there's ultra cold temperatures, we're hearing frozen temperatures. Those aren't something that we typically deal with in the supply chain on a daily basis. Outside the norm, but not daily. And I think when we're looking at vaccinating the entire United States, we need a robust plan. We need people that will raise their hand to want to do this, which I think you have a willing healthcare supply chain to do this. It's just a matter of becoming collaborative together, communicate amongst each other, and then let's execute on a plan that we can all agree upon in order to get the vaccine to patients, not just to approval, but to patients is what we need to focus on.
Thank you. Dr. Sharfstein, I think one of the realities that we're seeing is that we're seeing incredible time pressure put on science, put on the industry, put on the innovators that are out there trying to both discover a vaccine but then manufacture and distribute it. And at the same time, we see a lot of politicking. This is a time, of an election. And there are concerns really about trusting the science. Is science being able to give the leeway it needs to produce what it should do? Or are we taking shortcuts? And I know you have thoughts on this, on pressure on the FDA and others. But I guess I'll ask you a similar question. Should we all be able to trust what's developing?
Well, I think trust comes from expertise, knowing that people who know what they're doing are really making good decisions. It comes from data. It comes from transparency. It doesn't come from political interference that undermines trust. So I think we're poised to have a safe and effective vaccine. Really depends what the studies show. I think we're poised to have a good review process at the Food and Drug Administration with an independent advisory committee weighing in on the data and a lot of transparency. And we're poised for the agency to be explaining itself to the public about who should be getting the vaccine, and for advisory committees at CDC to weigh in. So I think that the pieces are moving into place, but those pieces could get knocked aside. And I think it's very dangerous when the president, accuses people at the agency of not moving fast enough for political reasons. In that case, I think he's really doing a lot of damage. He's making people see the agencies as primarily political, when really they're moving at the speed of science.
I would like to ask all of you, when I go to Elena, when the early stages of this virus were coming out, and we were every day, I was doing a show every day on where the tests were. Why didn't we have a national testing plan? And you get down to it and you go back and sort of look retroactively, and a lot of dysfunction between things like the FDA and the CDC. We also saw this virus, both in infection rates and mortality rates, hit parts of this nation in uneven ways. And the Hispanic population, the Black population, took on a huge burden. First, frontline workers. And so, again, I would come to you and say, what needs to be put in place so that we have a fair, just, even, solid response on COVID-19 that, along with supply chain, everything. I mean, I know you've been working on this. So what matters most for you and your community?
Well, two things. One is you have to have the data. The data collection by race and ethnicity is really important. And in our healthcare system, it's hit or miss. It's been optional. It's never been mandatory. And for an infectious disease of this magnitude that is harming and burdening all of America, but especially hotspots like African American, Hispanic, Native American, poor communities, rural communities, it's important to have that data identifiers. The second thing I think is it's important for people to realize people that live in the United States, even if they're not documented, need to be vaccinated. And we need health access big time in our communities. Latinos in this country have not applied for government programs. They mistrust government programs. So there needs to be messengers, the physicians, the nurses, the frontline workers in our healthcare system, our nursing homes, our community-based organizations. We all need to work with the public health agencies, and we need leadership that looks like us in the public health agencies and in our healthcare systems to be able to have more trust and to get the campaigns to our communities through the media and social media that we're already doing. We've been doing this all year. I think it's important to realize that a lot of the organizations that are healthcare related have jumped on the bandwagon to help.
Thank you for that, and we'll see how this rolls out, because I'm really interested in what kind of vaccines we're going to get. Josh, I don't know if you've been following. I kind of watch this grid, and I look at the various companies. There's some big pharma companies, some small pharma companies. They have different approaches, mRNA and DNA and others, and sort of, there are different phases and trials. CEPI funds some of this, and, DARPA, or not DARPA, but Operation Warp Speed with some of the manufacturing. Right. When you kind of look at it, and you look at that lineup, I don't know who's going to get over the line or what the differences come in. But can you just take us down the track for a minute to explain when we're going to be able to see a vaccine sort of in the marketplace for regular folks, and how that's going to be tiered between those who most need it versus not, and how are we going to deal with multiple vaccines?
So I think it's important to see this as, a series of stages. And you have to get past one stage for the next stage to even matter. And right now we're at the stage of getting data from the clinical trials that are going to tell us whether the vaccines are safe and effective when used in thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. And they're going to look to see whether people who got the vaccine are much less likely to get COVID than people who got a placebo. And they're going to look at safety data to make sure that the vaccine, doesn't cause any untoward side effects in that group that got the vaccine. Only when we know that can we get to the next stage, which is starting to think about who should get vaccinated. And not all the vaccine we'd like is going to be available right away. So there'll be a couple phases. In that first phase of vaccination, it will be people who are likely healthcare workers and people at very high risk for getting the coronavirus. And states are going to play a really important role in distributing the vaccine in collaboration with a bunch of different partners, including in the private sector. And then behind that, we're going to see a lot more manufacturing. Now, hopefully more than one vaccine will prove safe and effective so that we'll have multiple vaccines being manufactured. And I think in terms of the, could grandma be getting the vaccine? That may be a question for January, February. What about everyone else? That may be more of a question for the late spring or summer. But and that's if everything goes well. If those first phases have challenges, then everything gets put back. But to be in this position is a lot further ahead than ever before.
Well, Josh Sharfstein, I know you have to leave. I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to jump to Heather for a moment and ask her, when we talk about what our experiences were in the past, we had 150 million or so vaccinations of the flu in the last year, and then adding another 150 million on top. How does that work? Is the system able to carry that load?
The system is. I think the commercial supply chain is really built on efficiency and scale. So as long as we can do a repetitive activity, success will happen. I think to Josh's point around the phases, that will also play into how the distribution of this works. So to add into the COVID vaccine into the statuses of traditional vaccines and also flu vaccine at this point is going to follow the stages. And to me, there's two kind of supply chains in the US today. There's the public health supply chain, and then there's the commercial supply chain. And I think particularly when we add in the COVID vaccine, that's the time to really rely upon all of the entities that can vaccinate in our supply chain, such as pharmacists, such as physicians in independent channels. We have the ability, and at times we do tend to rely very heavily on the public health supply chain in order to vaccinate. We're going to need to use all of the supply chain, both the public health supply chain and the commercial supply chain, to make this happen. But from a distribution point of view, scale, efficiency, effectiveness, that's our bread and butter. That's what we win off of every day, and that's what we build off of every day.
Before we jump back to Elena for a minute, I want to ask you, there's this COVAX coalition, that's a global, I think there are 184 countries that are now members of it. Every other nation, they're kicking money into it. The United States is not a member of that. And I've interviewed the Minister of Health in Sweden who said, she's really worried about vaccine nationalism. And if America, which is such a big innovator and such a big part of the puzzle, isn't part of that, she's worried about a kind of law of the jungle out there. Are we worse off by not being part of COVAX? What are the implications of that?
Personally, I think, collaboration is the best way to go about this. We're in a global economy. We're in a global supply chain. A lot of the pharmaceuticals are started in other countries, finished in the US here in FDA-approved sites. We do need to think globally, but we need to act locally also. So I think us looking internally to understand how do we protect our healthcare workers, our highest risk, then roll this out. I think it would be beneficial if we would join that coalition, but we would also think about the global aspect. We're in a global pandemic. We're not in a US pandemic. We're not in a Sweden. You mentioned Sweden, Swedish pandemic. We're in a global pandemic. The global economy does need to come together, and the global healthcare system needs to come together, just because we have so much movement between countries and so much movement between continents.
Well, thank you for that. I should mention as I jump over to Elena and ask her, about how we get this equation right. I do want to give, the U.S. just this past week committed to give funding and support to CEPI, the Coalition for Economic Preparedness Innovations. It's about $20 million, which is a lot to some, but a drop in the bucket, frankly. compared to many countries that are giving there. So there are some coalitions the United States is a part of. But Elena, to come back to this question of when we see a rollout of vaccines, I interviewed Dr. Robert Redfield of the CDC, and he made the same point you did. He said, we're going to have to embrace a person without resources, a person who may be homeless and without shelter, contacts, who may be exposed. We're going to have to find a way to bring that person into being tested, if infected, give them, support and treatment. And otherwise, the system comes apart. And so I think what Heather just said about the global dimensions is so important. There are going to be parts of the world that are hard to reach. How can we, you're thinking about this a lot more than many of us are. How can we not just be philanthropic, but actually be committed, like our lives are on it, to make sure that we're inclusive as we reach out to the community that needs it?
I think one of the most important things the whole supply chain, every step of the way, can do is to think in terms of family-focused effort, not just individual effort. So the whole family needs to get vaccinated. The whole family needs to understand that what they're doing by getting vaccinated is helping other families. And then the families translate into neighborhoods. And if California has a whole health equity lined up. CDC has hotspots all over the country. There are neighborhoods and census tracts that can be focused on with the essential workers, the health workers, as well as those who are most vulnerable with chronic diseases already. And those people need to be protected first, as the National Academies of Medicine and Science, Engineering and Science have said, for their distribution plan. But I do think that there's an important role for commitment through media. We have a lot of people get information, not only from their providers, but for those who don't go see the doctor or don't go to the pharmacies to pick up medications, they get information through the media. And we have ethnic media that are mom and pop type newspapers, magazines, and then of course, the national networks in the Spanish language and other language, Asian languages, for example, have their own media stations, Univision, Telemundo, that really need to have the same message and work together with the Ad Council and create a major focus on the importance of vaccine. And I think we need to start now with the flu vaccine season upon us and the importance of getting involved. We're involved with the flu vaccine distribution messages with some of our partners and of course with CDC.
Well, I really appreciate it. I think that, Heather knows this business inside and out, knows what's out there. And one of the things is, as I've done a deep dive into it, you realize how complex I don't know whether to call it the backbone, the circulatory system, the tendons of the, supply chain is incredibly impressive. But I have to say, even with the concerns people have, I was very ignorant of a lot of what is out there and have tried to inform it. And so we have a big way to go when you think about the media and what we need to know, but others in terms of what that is out there and who the right messenger should be. But we've been taking questions from our audience, and we have a question from Daniel. Daniel?
Hi, my name is Daniel Hartnett. I'm Associate Managing Director, Role, Division of Duff & Phelps, based out of Reston, Virginia. My question today is, how do we ensure the integrity and the security of the COVID-19 vaccine supply chain? Namely, how do we ensure that various adverse actors don't slip into the end-to-end supply chain, be it from a security, theft, tampering, fraud, cybersecurity, and various other security-related perspectives? Thank you.
I want to get both your views, but let me start with Heather. Because this is a big deal, right? We're talking drugs today, like pharmaceuticals and therapeutics. But when you're trying to get a mask, I used to go on eBay and just see ridiculous things going on there. So how do we enhance and amp up security in our supply chain?
Well, one thing I think, if you're a patient going to get a vaccine, trust your local healthcare professionals that you always have. They then trust their supply chain partners that they've always used. As long as we continue to use the resources that we've used over the course of time, that is one, know your partner, trust your partner, validate your partner. The second thing is to be logical. I know that the CDC and Operation Warp Speed is treating the vaccine development and where the vaccine is being stored and how it would be disseminated as a national security event. They are taking it very seriously around the transmission of it. And I think it's a wonderful question and something that we don't always think about. We also, over the course of time, we don't always publish where our distribution locations are and where we have pharmaceuticals, just out of safety and security of our associates and our associates that are picking pharmaceuticals every day. And that's the same practice that I know my colleagues in this same space in the pharmaceutical supply chain also take very seriously. Really, it is, I think one of the key things is know your partner, know who you trust, and only do business with whom you trust at this point also.
Elena, how would you approach that as well? And thank you, Heather. Thank you, Daniel, for the question. But how do you approach this here? Because I think it's amply important for communities that already have a trust challenge, who don't see folks like them in the messaging. So, so one is perceived risk and the other is real risk. But your thoughts?
Yeah, the perception is very important. I think, everybody's talking about anti-bias training and the importance of having equity and inclusion. But I think what really matters is the messenger. And I have to, applaud what Heather said about trusting your own provider, making it local so that people can actually see who they're talking to. Trusting the federal government needs to have a face. And that was the whole, I think, part of the problem with this year's misuse of information or misinformation, I guess, is that the CDC is the public health department. And the CDC needs to be out there. The CDC, the public health agencies of the state governments, the local governments, working together with the faith-based, our religions are very important to our communities of color, and community leaders, community organizations. I think we do need to have a face and messengers lined up, a speakers bureau, if you will, of the importance of vaccines for COVID-19, since it's such an infectious disease. And I think the people in our communities need to understand that it's a very serious disease and how important a vaccine is to the decrease in the infection rates in our own families and communities.
Right. Well, look, I realize that this is a complex time and a stressed out country, a lot of choices. I really appreciate your thoughts on how we do this right, because I think there are choices out there. I also think that there are unacknowledged strengths out there in the supply chain and the medical chain that we haven't been talking enough about. But I think that, no matter how this election turns out, it's something we're going to have to get our heads around, rolling out vaccines and therapeutics in the right way. I really want to thank, he's not with us right now, but Joshua Sharfstein of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Heather Zenk of Amerisource Bergen Corporation, and Elena Ross of the National Hispanic Medical Association. I hope you'll be back, because this is going to be a story that we continue to cover. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was supposed to be Elena Rios, but that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to the Healthcare Distribution Alliance for their support, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.